morning, everyone. Hey, it's Tuesday morning, and I just got an email with a link to an article in the New Statesman, and you can see the title of the article is Age of Anxiety. I was really quite excited about that because I saw a lot of parallels in this article between the age the writer's describing and the early 20th century, framing the selections that you're reading for this week. So I'm going to scroll down here and show you the opening paragraph, and you see the subtitle for the article. The writer writes, "America seems to be in the midst of a full-blown panic attack. Is there anything we can do about it?" That rallying cry most definitely pertains to the anxiety of the early 20th century. And it's somewhat interesting as you read Gabriel Calla's opening. You see in the early paragraph, early part of the paragraph, he tries to frame this anxiety with other writers over the 20th century and builds a metaphor of a bell jar, Sylvia Plath's bell jar descending. And then he ends the paragraph with this quotation from Corinthians, a Judeo-Christian Bible, a very famous passage, obviously, that now we see through a glass darkly. And that is such an apt parallel between our current age and the blurred, disrupted, fragmented vision that writers testify to experiencing in the early 20th century. So then kind of thinking about some of those writers on the reading list for this week, you can, if you're far enough along in your reading, you can see again and again that those writers feel cut off from meaningful communication. They feel as if their vision is blurred and they can't really see what's truth. Well, the next paragraph from this article that I wanted to draw attention to, I love this passage where he writes, "I was a small being hobbled by fear. In the ensuing years, I have experienced these moments of pure compression, the universe eaten alive by dread, consisting of only me and my own death with some frequency. Other passengers on the subway are reduced to shadows, the rattle of the train, a faint echo of my own deafening heartbeat, and the glass haze of terror blots out the light." Well, you might be thinking that doesn't seem quite in line with E.A. Robinson, and I'll admit that Robinson does have a comic tone in his poems, but were you to read more than the three that were assigned for this week, you would see each of those characters searching for meaning and certainty and never able to find it. So, for instance, in Richard Cory, we have the central character in that little poem as, by outward appearances, having everything: wealth, finesse, fineness, but a desolation of spirit, and he goes home and commits suicide. In Men of Archivi, we have a character who feels he's been born in the wrong era, and he is cut off tragically from the era in which he retreats, that medieval age of chivalry and knights. And yes, Robinson renders that as comic, showing the hopelessness of that longing for a past, bygone era that was as savage and brutal. And then you think about Mr. Flood's Party. That one, to me, is executed in the most poignant way as Mr. Flood coming home at night. He's a drunk, and apparently that's gone on for some years. He delivers his monologue, but there's no one to listen, and even the natural environment is kind of cut off from him. The moon is not particularly receptive to his ramble about the meaninglessness of his existence. So that fragmented communication, isolation, and self-medication in that particular poem most definitely bespeaks of a sickened soul. Robert Frost's poetry is perhaps just a little different. He has a wider range of themes that he picks up, and because he was poet laureate, He was summoned to write some more optimistic poetry too. But if you again think about the poems assigned for us, we have Mending Wall, where the speaker questions this tradition of building walls between neighbors, what function that serves besides cutting people off from each other. Then, if you think about After Apple Picking, there is a speaker who has worked so hard his entire life and has been so careful to bring the apples in unbruised, untarnished. And his ladder, he says, is still pointing toward the sky, but he's so tired. So, sorry about that little glitch. He's so tired, he just wants to quit. And there are other Robert Frost poems that I'm sure you are well acquainted with. The poem Two Roads Diverged in a Wood is widely read in high schools. Possibly you've studied Birches, which is a nostalgic longing for the better days of youth and innocence in a world that's just not sensitive to that. Well, now we're making the transition to Dorothy Parker, and you might be questioning my thesis here because those poems that you read are funny. Well, okay, so Sigmund Freud says we use humor to mask or distance ourselves from what is most painful. And Dorothy Parker's life screams out that pain. She in the poetry that you read, she undercuts a very serious idea that she pursues with this kind of comic element. But if I could scroll down here and find another poem, Resume is the name of it, but there is also a play on words there. We're acquainted with the word resume. Well, this is a poem about suicide, and in it she lists off various ways a person might go about committing suicide, and all of those are inferior. They've all got a problem. So she ends the poem, you might as well live. Again, yes, comic, but very deep and tragic if one considers that poem in the context of Dorothy Parker's own life and her struggles with alcoholism. And then the broader picture of thinking about the early 20th century, where conventional knowledge and wisdom, the surety of a Judeo-Christian God looking out for humankind, that had crumbled. The surety of rural life with traditional values and people having a place in a community, that had crumbled in an age of industrialization where so many people were forced to the cities to try to find work. And then, of course, the mass of humanity crammed together. And the economy was shifting as well. And then I had mentioned in my email to you what we'll see in this early part of the 20th century, of course, the outbreak of World War I, immediately followed by the Age of Defiance of the Roaring Twenties, and frantic attempts to keep that defiance from happening. And then that gives way to the Great Depression, followed by World War II, just an era of fragmentation and hopelessness.